Welcome, Mr. Jermaine Nairn.
Thank you very much, Mark. And no, I do not have my stamp and seal. Madam President, members of the executive, HR superheroes, all good afternoon. You recognize the title? Let me first express my gratitude for the invitation to speak this afternoon. It is an absolute pleasure to be among such an august crowd, and of course to celebrate with you your 45th year as an association. I thought it was a perfect segue just now from the conversation, the very topical conversation around generations in the workforce. First, to speak a little bit about neurodivergence. Of course, it is equally important, but less discussed. And I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, that by the end of my presentation, you'll be asking yourself, am I neurodivergent? And you might be looking at the person next to you through the side of the eye. But today I want to reframe the conversation around such a very important issue and move it from us seeing it as a challenge, not just within society, but a challenge within our workspaces, to really leveraging the opportunities they're in so that our people really don't just survive the workplace as many are surviving, but they are thriving. And so the first question, of course, is what is neurodivergence? If I had to sum up what neurodivergence is, in a nutshell, it really speaks about variations in how the brain functions and processes information. Variations from the societal standards of what typical is. And so on the one hand, you have those who are neurotypical. So their brains function in what we call typical conventional ways. And on the other hand, there are those whose brains really don't function that way. And so some of the presentations of neurodivergence are things such as ADHD, both in terms of the hyperactive aspect and the inattentive aspect. We're talking about dyslexia, dyscalculia, autism, various degrees on the spectrum. And so today I want to first and foremost say neurodivergence is not a disorder. It is not a challenge for us to run from, but instead, it really ought to be embraced. And of course, the reframing has to cause us to identify those unique strengths of neurodivergence as opposed to isolating the challenges and focusing on those. And so globally, there has been quite an increase in neurodivergence. And let me just say, that it is expected that by the early 2030s, up to 30% of the workforce will be neurodivergent. Yeah. Now let us pause for a moment. I want you to look around your table. Look at the individuals beside you, to your left and to your right. I want you to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. You have at least 5 people at your table? So let me tell you, globally, what currently obtains is that 1 in 5 people is neurodivergent. I don't want you to ask the person next to you, are you that one? Because I know you're not owning it. So ladies and gentlemen, this kind of presentation sees where we have 20% of the global population being classified as neurodivergent. That's up to 1.6 billion people. Now, you may ask, why is this increase happening so rapidly? This increase is due mainly to 2 things, really. 1, heightened awareness, and 2, heightened testing. And so we're seeing, for example, autism diagnoses increasing by 787% globally. Prescriptions for ADHD medication have surged by 800%. And it's so interesting because yesterday I was having a conversation with my wife, and she was telling me about a situation where a couple, a medical couple, one is a neurosurgeon and the other one is a general practitioner. They both present with ADHD and they're both on medication to ensure that they maintain stability. So ADHD is not a disability, yes? But I'll come back to that in a little bit. So we have dyslexia, autism, and ADHD constituting approximately 70% of all neurodevelopmental diagnoses. And as far as, well, I spoke about the prescription already. So what are some of the myths, ladies and gentlemen? Neurodivergent people are not less stable. That's one of the first things we have to recognize. A lot of people think, oh, they are less than in terms of capabilities. That is not true. The needs of neurodivergent people will become a cost to the organization. That's a perspective that you may have if you don't understand the returns on investment in neurodivergent individuals. One size fits all leadership works. Absolutely not. In the same way that we had the conversation about the multi-generational workforce and the requirement of customized leadership because each generation is different, there must be recognition that there are many differences in the neurodivergent population, many of which you have already identified, some of which you are working with, but you may not have recognized that this is what is happening. So what are the realities that we face? Many neurodivergent individuals excel in pattern recognition. You have some members on your team who can identify issues quickly, identify patterns. Yes? When you're talking about some accountants, for example, in your organization, they look at a spreadsheet and automatically they can identify a trend or two. They are very creative. There was a time when, for whatever reason, we used to divorce creativity from leadership because leaders are supposed to be serious and rigid. Now we're recognizing that an enhancement to leadership is creativity. And there are many leaders who, and HR practitioners fall in this category, who make blood out of stone because they're so creative. And part of the reason they're able to do that and do it effortlessly is because they're neurodivergent. But I don't want to get you trembling just yet. A lot of neurodivergent individuals have systems thinking packed. And of course, in this age where we need to ensure that we're anticipating certain phenomena and responding to certain phenomena, we need this kind of thinking in our organization. Another reality is that accommodations unlock performance. Now, I was deliberate earlier about looking around the room to see all the people who were playing with the little devices on the table. You see those little balls? Green and red and orange? There are some people who sat there, they were listening and they were constantly rolling the ball like this, and they were constantly squeezing it. That is one of the simplest accommodations within a space for a neurodivergent person to concentrate. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without that very small device, many people would have been wondering or thinking about lunch because we're running behind time. So that's just one of the simple areas, and we'll look at accommodations later on in the presentation. Inclusive leadership expands performance. One of the things we have to be deliberate about is ensuring that we do not isolate individuals, because in isolating them, the performance will diminish. So what is the perspective that you have? Is neurodivergence to you a challenge? Or are you going to leverage the superpower that is neurodivergence? Again, let me remind you that by the early 2030s, you will have up to 30% of your employees being neurodivergent. So we cannot escape their inclusion in the workspace. But what is important is that we are preparing and accommodating. So, as far as seeing them as a crutch is concerned, we will end up having a lack of understanding about what this really is. We will exclude the accommodations that are necessary for them to thrive. And we will use traditional means to evaluate and reward them and those means will be downright ineffective. So what is the result of that? These individuals end up being overwhelmed, they underperform, and we have incorrect assessment of them. And if we all reflect on the quote from Albert Einstein that says that everyone is a genius, but if a fish is judged by its ability to climb a tree, then it will think that it is stupid. When we think about neurodivergent individuals, it is a similar thing. If they are having as a superpower systems thinking, and you're all over the place in your presentation, and let us not fool ourselves, some of us as leaders, we're not as organized, and that may be due to some of the things. But without that specific customized approach to understanding the individual, we'll not be able to lead them as effectively as we should. So we turn our attention to the superpower aspect of things. This is where we ensure that we match individuals based on their strengths so that they can optimize these strengths and thrive in these roles. This is where we ensure that the superpower comes out by giving them those supportive tools and accommodation. This is where we ensure that coaching and mentorship, especially within the realities of having millennials and Gen Zers who thrive on coaching and mentorship, and structured clarity in place for the neurodivergent individuals. What is the result? Enhanced creativity, problem solving, innovation, and retention. And so when we think about three of the most common ones, dyslexia, ADHD, and autism, we see where dyslexic, big picture, strategic thinking is something that many organizations, especially in first world countries, the UK in particular, they are leveraging this big picture thinking. When we talk about ADHD and hyperfocus and rapid ideation, these are attributes that we want from our employees in our organizations. And I tell you this, it is now found that 60% of entrepreneurs globally present with ADHD. Why? Because ADHD in particular strengthens resilience. ADHD causes individuals to quickly move on from failures. And we heard earlier that failure is a part of success. ADHD causes these individuals to not be stuck in a place where they can't move from what happened to them, but instead ideate more quickly to come up with solutions and move on to the next thing. And so entrepreneurs, the most successful entrepreneurs in particular, are those who are constantly churning out ideas. And here is one of the pluses of ADHD. The fear of starting over is diminished, which is why they're so successful. And so you're finding that the successful entrepreneurs globally are those who are able to start a business, start another one, start a third one, start a fourth one, and they just keep going and going and going. And with the right support, what is being found is that the A student, the A plus student in class, is the student who the ADHD entrepreneur is employing to run that business. So ladies and gentlemen, we have some work to do. Likewise with autism, pattern recognition, stick-to-itiveness, these are the people you want in compliance. Because if the policy says, then it is according to the policy. These are the people you want in procurement. Because if the policy says, then the policy says. Yes? And so you won't have to worry about the dishonesty and all of these things that we face, some of us face, some of you face in your organizations. So ladies and gentlemen, of course, leading a neurodivergent workforce is one thing. But some leaders are themselves neurodivergent. And so some frequently observed strengths, hyper-focus on mission strength goals, high integrity and direct communication. We spoke about the high integrity just now. You have some people in your organization, you don't have to put up your hands, who you ever wonder how this one just so plain without them talk. Like they couldn't just filter what you said. They may fall in a particular category. May fall in a particular category. Unique problem-solving approaches, and visionary thinking and innovation. A lot of times, what we find is that neurodivergent employees think outside the box, and they are disruptors. Much, unfortunately, much to the annoyance of many HR practitioners, because this is how we've always done it. Yes? But we need to take a second look at them. And so on screen, you will see some very notable names. Steve Jobs from Apple, for example, Sir Richard Branson. And Sir Richard Branson is very open with it. Yes? He will tell you that he's neurodivergent, but he leverages all his visionary strengths, his problem-solving strengths, and he identifies talent to run his various businesses. So he's the visionary, and we need these visionaries in our organizations, but we also need those who will say, come, Sir Richard, hold on, give that 2 more weeks, because of the speed that he may operate. Bill Gates, John Anthony Hopkins, and Simone Biles, these are some very notable names who are neurodivergent, and it has not stopped their show. So as we reflect on how we build capacity in our organization, let us not become weary with how we support them, but instead focus on how they can add value to the organization with these presentations. So, what are the leadership style shifts that we need to make? For many reasons, including our culture, our history, our organizations are very hierarchical. And so there is greater need for flexibility in our organization so that we may accommodate a wide variety of perspectives, a wide variety of viewpoints, so that we can all coexist. Of course, we need clarity over convention. It is not enough to say that this is how we've always done it. Similar to the Gen Zers and the millennials who want to know why. A lot of times, neurodivergent employees question why particular tasks are being given, and out of frustration, we just tell them because they're being instructed. But I know that doesn't happen in your organizations. Those are for the people who never made it here today. Another shift that needs to be made is that we get to structured and predictable feedback. Of course, if we're talking about growth and understanding individuals who present in a particular way, it means that we must have a particular cadence that guides the conversation with them. In a lot of instances, they want to see the progress that they're making. They want to know how they're contributing to the whole, and they want to see the different parts of the puzzle coming together. And it is oftentimes through feedback and coaching that happens. So we get back to leading the neurodivergent workforce. We want to communicate with clarity. We want to offer flexible work environments. We want to prioritize psychological safety. And I want to stick a pin right there, a red pin. Psychological safety, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know as HR practitioners, according to what Professor Amy Edmondson coined, is the felt permission for candor. So in other words, I feel like I can speak to you openly without fearing certain repercussions. Within the neurodivergent space, one of the most important things to your employees is the comfort of being able to talk to you as leaders. Otherwise, what happens is another layer of shutdown, which negatively influences how they think and ultimately how they perform, which means that your bottom line is going to be affected. So, this practice, especially within the Jamaican space, of being rigid, of having a boss culture as opposed to a coaching culture, of having an environment where, because I'm the boss, you must listen to me, of having an environment where, as the boss, I am here and you are down there, and you must understand who you are. We have to do away with that. Psychological safety cannot thrive within an environment where people are fearful. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, psychological safety is about a group dynamic in relation to a particular leader or leaders. So, yes, if you take that approach, if you choose to take that approach, where I am up here and you are down here, then what is going to happen is what Professor Edmondson calls the epidemic of silence, where the people will comply in front of you, and then behind you, they say, man, you don't say that not work. I know you cannot